Good morning. At least I hope it's morning where you are. It's certainly morning where I am here in the Napa Valley. And today we begin one of the major lectures of this whole communications marketing theme, which is public relations. And this is an area where I've spent a certain amount of my professional career working. So it's something I have a real affinity for and a real love for, and I hope you, by the end of this lecture, begin to see the potential of public relations, the full expression of how it can do something for your company, and just enjoy it. Meanwhile, speaking of enjoyment, I do want to point out that we do a podcast, rickandpaulwine.com, and if you want some ideas on how to talk about wine other than the way the traditional wine people talk about wine, here is 6 seasons worth of stuff on Capital Public Radio's website where we talk about wine in a new way, and it'll give you an idea of the new kind of language we're talking about. Now, when I mention public relations, I think I've given you my description already, which is the definition of public relations is relationships with publics. And if we were in a classroom setting, I would literally challenge you as a group to come up with a list of all the publics that a wine company might have. But since we're not in that setting, I've given you an enormous break, and I've done it for you. So how many publics do you have? And let's start with the obvious ones, because when people think of public relations, they generally think of media. Print media, New York. Wouldn't it be great to get a story in the New York Times or in the Wine Spectator? Electronic. Wouldn't it be great to get a story on WinePair? Bloggers. There are, Lord knows, any number of bloggers who write about wine these days. Podcasts, God bless us. And then there's social media. Social media meaning not so much educated journalists writing for a larger public, but average consumers writing for their own friends and their own relationships. And then we have the trade. And within the wine industry, of course, trade encompasses a lot of different things. It encompasses not only let's say retailers and restaurateurs, but distributors, importers. On the production side of things, I would suggest that winery suppliers, for example, are a legitimate audience for a public relations campaign, etc. And then, of course, consumers. Consumers are the target market, and one of the reasons we spend so much time talking to media is that you can talk to one journalist, let's say the New York Times, and reach literally hundreds of thousands or even millions of consumers with that one article. So very cost-effective way to reach consumers. Let's not forget your neighbors. As Dario Satui will tell you, your neighbors can make your life miserable if you don't keep them happy. So certainly you should, in any business you start, have a concept of how you're going to deal with the local neighborhood. Local officials, we'll talk about this a little more, but I've been part of a campaign that really attacked an overlooked part of the Napa Valley Vintners communication program when we started developing relationships with the local city councils, the local county supervisors. These are the people who pass the regulations. These are the people who make the planning commission decisions that ultimately determine what kind of business can be called a winery or not, for example. So pretty important people that often don't get any attention until, oh my gosh, we're going in front of them on Thursday afternoon. How well do we know these guys? And that's where spending some time with them ahead of time is a valuable process. And so many more. Employees, obviously, often a frequently overlooked public. But trust me, if your employees don't believe what you're saying, it won't happen. And so making sure that they're on board, making sure that they communicate and believe what it is you're communicating is a key element to any public relations campaign. And then finally, we're looking at employees. Let's talk about, sorry, not employees, but owners. The shareholders of a company, a valuable and important process, because if they don't believe in things, they're going to close the doors. So lots of different publics, and my suggestion to you is you need a common message and a common theme for all of this, but beyond that, you need specific activities and ways to communicate with each of these audiences. So again, how do we start with public relations? It's a marketing campaign. So pure and simple, the first thing you need is your key message. What makes you unique? Then, of course, identifying your audience. And this is where public relations can be such a valuable discipline, because you really do work through and identify each one of these audiences. How do I talk to that person? How do I talk to that group? How do I attract that group? All of those sorts of things. Then you deliver the message, and we'll talk about that a lot today, and ultimately evaluate the results. So no different from any other marketing campaign. Always remember, when you start one of these programs, first thing you have to do is nail down these specific 4 steps: message, audience, delivery, evaluation. So let's not forget that PR is a function of marketing. And of course, we know marketing is finding a need in the market and then developing a product to fill it. It's the promotion and protection and enhancement of your brand. And this is where public relations, I think, really ends up playing a key role. What is your brand? How can you make it worth more money? How can you make it more meaningful to consumers and everyone else? That's public relations. And then finally, it plays a key role in defining and communicating, or the communication of, your position. So we're back to that same old question again, aren't we? What is your position? What makes you different from every other destination, winery, hotel, restaurant on the planet? And again, if you can't answer this in 10 words or less, you can't do marketing or PR. Typo there. Can't do marketing or PR. Remember Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Remember the 10 Commandments. Those are too many. You need to keep it simple, sweet, so that you can effectively communicate it and so that people can easily remember it. We have so much stuff to remember these days. If it takes a paragraph and a half to explain why you're different, I'm sorry, people just won't know, and they just won't care. Looks like the sun has come out, so I'm going to pause this recording briefly and adjust my lighting. Okay, I think that should be a little better now. We'll see. Questions about that? Let's keep moving on. Okay. Well, no, it's not going to allow me to do this. Here we are, finally. Sorry for the technical glitch there, but I think we've got that solved. So let's talk about the delivery systems for public relations. There's the media, obviously, both traditional and social media. And the other 2 areas that I'd really include in public relations are events and promotions. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about both of those. So how do you get your message to the media and other publics? I'd like you to think about this not in terms of a marketing campaign, but in fact, a marketing question strategy, which is, if marketing is looking for a need in the market, what does the media need or want? If our job as public relations people is to sell our story, is to develop our product into this potential market, the media, what do they need? What do they want? Well, that's an interesting question. Why all the focus on media? Because you can talk to just one journalist and reach 1 million people or millions of people. Even social media, you talk to one person and yet, sure, if it becomes viral, hundreds of thousands of people see it. But even if it doesn't become viral, if it just goes out to, let's say, 250 people per person that you contact, if you contact 1,000 people, that's 250,000 people. So still an effective way to reach people. So these are our customers. In terms of pitching stories, in terms of pitching public relations outreach, what do they want? Well, one thing they may not want quite so much is stories about wine. This is a rather terrifying data sheet here. This chart shows you the World Wide Web searches for wine over time from 2004 through 2016. And what it shows you is, starting in 2005, it has gone steadily downhill every year since. Why are people looking for wine less and less and less? And I would add another question to this. What's the spike? If you're clever and you think about that for a minute, why does it spike every year? It spikes every year around the holiday season because that's when people are looking for, oh my gosh, what can I possibly buy my Uncle Bob who knows so much about wine? Or, ooh, I have to get a bottle for someone who knows something about wine. So they go online and search a bunch. But if you look at that trend, both for the Wine Spectator and the Wine Enthusiast, the two leading wine publications in America today, their searches have gone significantly down over the last, 20 years. The problem? I believe it's because too much of what they find doesn't help them. It sounds too much the same. It's simply not of value to them. But the figures don't lie. People are looking for wine less and less. And if you look at wine blogs, how many wine blogs are there in the world? Actually in the United States. Look at 2005, there's a big spike. It goes up and up and up. It actually increases over the course of the Great Recession of 2008, 9, and 10, possibly because people were spending less money buying wine and maybe spending more time blogging about it. But in the end, since then, it has consistently gone down as well. Frankly, there's less interest in wine on the internet, in talking about wine, looking up wine, searching for wine, than there has been in the last 10 years. And that trend doesn't show any reason or any indication of change. So that's going to continue. In order to break out of those patterns, we need to figure out something smart, which is, I hope, what we're going to do today. So let's compare print versus web in terms of the media, in terms of how they work and what their values are to you as someone who hopes to get a story printed in one of those publications. Print, of course, is long-lasting. As we all know from our dentist office or our doctor's office, those magazines in those offices sit around for months and God knows how many people see them. In fact, most print publications give you two numbers for their circulation being the number of people who see the publication. One of them is how many people actually get it, and then the second one is the number of people who probably see it after that first person gets it. So you might see something like, well, our paid subscription is 100,000, but our total circulation is 250,000 because we estimate that every publication, every issue, every copy gets seen by 2.5 people. May not be accurate, certainly when you stand in the supermarket and in the line at the cashier and look at some of those publications. Print coverage is generally considered more credible than online, so people believe it more than they believe they believe something that's printed on a piece of paper more than they believe that ephemeral image that appears on their phone or on their screen. And it is easier to measure because people often very specifically pay for subscriptions. So you want to know how many people read the Wine Spectator? I can't give you that number exactly, but I can tell you exactly how many people pay for it because that's part of their measured circulation. So you can absolutely measure that. And you can also measure, for example, as some public relations agencies do, we did this when I was in the business, you measure how much of the story is about you. So if there's a story about Pinot Noir in America, and it mentions 12 Pinot Noirs you should try, and one of them is yours with a little 2-word tasting note, nice and fresh, that's probably less value than a similar article or a similar size article in the same publication that's a complete identity piece on how did this winery start, where did it get to where it's going, what kind of wines does it make, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how you not only measure how many people see any given article, but you also measure how big the mention of your company is in that article. Those are both ways you measure PR. Now in the web, it's much quicker. By the way, the Wine Spectator, for example, their lead time is generally about 3 months. So they start putting together the publication 3 months in advance. So if you want to be in an issue that appears in October, you need to start talking to them in June, because by August, it's pretty much put to bed. It's been written. Now they've got to typeset it and add photos and do all the rest of that stuff. But if you don't talk to them in June, if you say, ooh, there's an article, they're doing an issue on Pinot Noir in Monterey in October, and you call them up in September and say, hey, how can I get into that article? They will tell you that article went to press a month ago. You're too late. Web, not so much. You can talk to a journalist, and if your timing is right, this is certainly the way newspapers work, is you can talk to them the day before and say, I have important information to share with you. I think it ought to be in the story. And if they're not absolutely buried in writing the actual story, they can include that in the article. It's also easier to correct. So if you see something in an article that's incorrect, they say that you make 1,000 cases and it's actually 100,000 cases. That's a figure that both you and they will want to correct. So in that case, in a print publication, that's, as a dear friend of mine once said, that's what page 2 is for. But it comes out 6 weeks later, or even in a newspaper 2 days later, or a day later saying, yeah, so production for this winery is 100,000. They usually don't say what they said wrong. They just say, here's the correct statement about that fact. In the internet, they can literally go online and change the story almost while you talk to them. So the sooner you correct it, the fewer people will see it in its incorrect form, and the more people, when they see the article, will see the correct information. Pretty simple, straightforward thing to do. By the way, a correction is a correction of fact. If somebody writes a story about how they don't like your Chenin Blanc because it's too oaky, and you disagree with that, that's not a factual correction. You can't call them up and tell them they have to change that story any more than you can call up your mother and tell her she has to change her opinion. It ain't going to work. It's just going to make them angry. So be very careful that when you call, it's specifically to correct factual errors rather than matters of opinion. One good thing about SEO, or rather about web PR, is that it builds SEO, search engine optimization. In other words, if you have a story appear on the web about you, then when people type in your name, it moves your name closer to the top of some of the search engines that look for you. Now, this is usually a good thing. You want, if people type in Monterey Pinot Noir, you would like your name to creep up to the top of that list if at all possible. But bear in mind, for example, there are a number of different people in the wine industry whose name is Hill. There's a Hill Estates, there's a William Hill. One of those people, and neither of those two, by the way, has been involved in some fairly unpleasant litigation and implications and, in fact, convictions for fraud. So you want to be very careful when you get your SEO numbers up that it's not because you've done something illegal, and when people search for your name, what they discover is this terrible story about some things you did. Now, we once worked with a company who a previous owner had done some very questionable environmental practices on their vineyard. It was an ugly story. They bought the vineyard. New management, new vision, but the problem was when you searched for that vineyard online, what you discovered was these horrible stories. And so we made a really big intentional effort to generate a lot of stories about new ownership, new direction, lots of quotes from the local regulatory authorities saying how pleased they were the situation was under control, so that after a few months, enough of those stories appeared that when you searched for that vineyard, what popped up were stories about what a good environmental partner they were, rather than how they had raped and pillaged the land. So, important to know. And then finally, web coverage, attention on the internet is simply more accessible. When you're in a wine shop, it's tough to run over and pull out a copy of Wine Spectator and thumb through the pages to find what you need. But of course, we all know that. We all just pull things up on our phone, which is why, as a way of complicating or confusing this matter even more, most of the major publications, print publications, do have at least something online, some version of their publication online that is also searchable. Now, the Wine Spectator, if you really want all the details, you gotta buy a subscription. but it does have some information about some wines as you search through. So it's a good example of how print reaches, in some ways, reaches both worlds. But in order to really understand how all of this works, you need to address all of these elements. You need to talk to print, you need to talk to broadcast, which is radio and television. Not always easy with wine, but we'll talk about maybe a little bit of how you can do that. And then various web sources, whether that be social media, blogs, podcasts, or influencers. Okay, that's the market. And as I said before, if marketing teaches you anything, it's to find out what the market wants and then create something that they can use. So that's what we're going to talk about next. What is it that the media wants? And you know this from social media. What people want is cute pictures of puppies and kittens, right? Well, don't ignore that when you're marketing your wine. But here are the kinds of stories. When we called up news editors years ago and asked them, what kind of stories do you always have room for? Here are some of their answers. Number one, best of stories. And we've seen these everywhere. The best 5 wineries in Napa, the best 5 places for a pedicure in Sonoma, the 5 best pet-friendly restaurants in Monterey County. All of those sorts of things, best of, those are easy stories to sell. They fill a nice little niche, and they also play into a broader scope of a public relations strategy. Let's use an example of a very small winery. Oh, but let's pick the big time, in Napa. Not very well known, not very famous for anything in particular, but they managed to pitch a story of 5 great places to go taste Napa Valley Cabernet, and they list Opus One, and they list Silver Oak, and they list, let's add the Castle up at Castello Dama, and Robert Mondavi Winery, and Paul's Famous Wines here. It's called a roundup story in public relations strategy, and basically what it does is includes you in a group of more powerful people as if you belong. Nice technique, huh? If you can do it and you can pull it off and make an argument that you belong there, it works. And this is really no different from what Robert Mondavi did, 70 years ago, when he started going on the road taking bottles of the Grand Cru Bordeaux, the first growth Bordeaux. So he would bring in Chateau Latour, Chateau Margaux, Chateau Lafite Rothschild, and Robert Mondavi Winery. It's a roundup story. He would encourage people to taste those blind, and to be fair to Robert, his wine didn't always come out first. Sometimes it came fourth, sometimes second, sometimes third. That wasn't his point. His point was he belonged in the same category. He was playing in the same league as the greatest Cabernet-based wines in the world. And that's the essence of a roundup story. And that's where these best of stories really give you an opportunity to try some things. Next big category people love, best values. And you know this because anyone who's ever found out that you're studying wine, the first thing they ask you is, so what's a good deal in wine today? And editors are no different. They always want to know what's the best deal. And of course, it's a little bit of a problem here because as we remember from our market positioning, lower prices generally mean lower quality to the consumer. So you need to carefully work this story. But if you want to be included in a best value story and you can create a best value story about your brand, I think you're going to be in great shape in terms of giving the media exactly what they want. Now we come to one of the real nuts to crack for the wine industry, which is news. You don't have any, okay? Just pure and simple, you don't have any. I always say that the old joke is the 2 happiest days of a boat owner's life are the day he buys the boat and the day he sells the boat. Well, the 2 happiest days, or the 2 news days of any winery are the day they start the winery and the day they go bankrupt. Those are the 2 news stories. The fact that you've hired a new cellar master, not news. For God's sakes, there are 10,000 wineries in America. A new cellar master at a winery, even a new winemaker at a winery is probably not news, except maybe to his mom and maybe an industry technical journal like the Wine Business Monthly Group, something like that. The fact that you've released a new Sauvignon Blanc, I'm sorry, there are 150,000 wines available in the U.S. market. There are 150,000 wines released, and the fact that yours is one of them, not news. The fact that you've cut back on the oak, not news. So the more you think about what you're doing, it's not news. And we're going to talk a little bit about how wineries can get news a little later, but just to give you an idea, press releases per se should be used. Sun's coming back out again, very nice. Press releases should be used to communicate news. They should not be used to communicate feelings about the winery. Now, there are a couple of elements to this where you can tie this together. Harvest stories. What's this year's harvest look like? If you can get out there first with a definitive answer, remember why it's called news? It's new. Remember what Lois Lane's always looking for in those Superman movies? She's looking for the scoop. If you can call up somebody and give them the first indication that the harvest is going to be great, that's probably news. Every year, some sparkling wine winery in the North Coast gets on television because they start picking first. And that's their way of saying the harvest has started. The fact that somebody else does it 3 days later, not news. Old news, already been told. So any place you can be first, that's important, and look for ways that you can do that, okay? Next is, even if the news isn't all that interesting, interesting photos can save a not so interesting story. And when we get into the press kit, I'll talk about how important this is. But we've put our clients on the front page of some sections of newspapers and things simply because we had a better photograph than some of our competitors. All of our competitors had the classic winemaker photograph, either standing leaning on a barrel or with his or her nose in a glass, right? We came up with some different ways to do that, and our clients ended up on the front page. And again, all this goes back to you need to be unique, you need to be different, you need to be new. That's what creates the scoop, because ultimately what the media wants, and as we talked about this in advertising, what the media wants is more readers. Because the more readers they have, the more readers they can sell to their advertisers, and that's how they make money. So on the one hand, the stories are what they create to attract readers. It's a little bit like the kind of bait they use to catch fish. They then catch the fish and sell the fish to their advertisers. Let's not talk about what happens to the fish after they get there. So how do you work with the media? This is what I spent my life doing. First of all, you have to get to know them and build those relationships. It is not fair to call up a journalist and suddenly out of the blue say, I have a story, or I'd like to talk to you about a story you're working on. They have no idea who you are. They have no idea why they should believe you rather than someone else. And so as they look at this entire process, you have relatively little credibility. And remember that many journalists feel that they are almost constantly under siege from amateur PR people who call them up and say, I'm really important and need to talk to you about something. And they say, okay, what is it? We want to tell you about our new Chardonnay. And the journalist hangs up the phone. So to me, the key element is you got to get to know these people before you talk to them. And the first way to do that, you read their articles. I always remember every journalist I've ever spoken to about this topic has said the same thing, that probably somewhere between 20 and 80% of all the pitches they get from PR people are simply wrong for them. I have one famous writer who told me, Paul, I've never written about a wine. I don't write about wines that cost more than $10 because and this was some years ago, to be fair, because my readers can't afford to buy wines over $10. And yet I would guess that half the phone calls I get from PR people are people who say, we really want to pitch you on this fabulous new $40 bottle of wine. And she says, you can send me a sample, but I won't write about it because I don't write about those wines. It is funny, as the creators of a podcast that's got a certain amount of following in the world, we regularly get pitches from PR people about having guests on our show. I'm quite sure they've never listened to the show because they would never want their guest to be on our show because their guest probably talks very seriously about wine and we would make endless fun of them. They don't realize that. They've never listened to the podcast. They just think, oh gosh, these guys are fun. Let's put some people on here and see if we can't get some attention. So read the articles. This does two things. It tells you what not to pitch, right? Because if they make a point of, gosh, they've never written about, for example, there's one writer who writes in New York who only writes about North American wines, doesn't write about European wines. Doesn't write about European wines, well, you can call him and ask him, why don't you do that? And he may say, my editor tells me I'm only supposed to write about American wines. Great, then we won't send you the European wines we are thinking about. It tells you what not to pitch, but it also tells you what to pitch. If there is a journalist, Matt Kramer is a good example for the Spectator up in Oregon, who writes a lot about terroir and is really kind of geeky and techie about that kind of wine, then if you can send him a story that challenges him and is interesting to him, he'll be interested in that. On the other hand, if you want to sell him on writing a story about your great Napa Valley Cabernet, you're going to die a horrible death because he doesn't like the wines and he doesn't like the style and he doesn't write about that stuff. So, want to know what a journalist thinks? Read the articles, read the articles, read the articles. And as you read them, of course, you may see a wonderful story about a small family winery and think, oh, they should write about me next. And the answer is, you know what? They just wrote that article. They just wrote an article about a small family winery. Now they probably need to write about something different. So the way to pitch that story is not to say, well, you just wrote about our next door neighbor, now you should write about us. And he's going to say, no, I wrote about your next door neighbor, and that's enough stories on Oregon Pinot for now. But if you come into him and say, you know, you wrote a great story about Oregon Pinot, but there's some people who are really doing things differently, and I've put together a group of 4 wineries that are really different from the one you wrote about. Would you be interested? Then they can do a follow-up story and say, here are a few things I didn't mention in the first story that are worth talking about. Again, read the stories, read the articles, and understand the point of view of the journalist before you pitch anything. And when you do call them, and by the way, I used to call journalists all the time, just send them a quick text or an email saying, great story, love this, or that was an interesting story about Bordeaux, but you know, I think you missed a key point here, and make a little point in the side and get a little feedback. But I will tell you that most journalists work in an almost complete vacuum. They honestly don't know who reads their stuff. They don't know why people read it. They respond primarily to direction from an editor. So if they hear from an actual reader, they are always grateful. Even if it's to say, no, Paul, I think you're wrong about that. The fact that you are opening a dialogue with this journalist is a valuable thing to do. And the more you have dialogue with journalists, the more you understand their interests. And then when you call them up and say, hey, you know, you studied music, have you ever thought about doing a story about Carl Wente, who not only makes wine for a big wine company, but has a band where he writes his own music, and it might be sort of interesting for you to follow up on that. And now you may have a way of really moving that journalist towards a story. Ultimately, your job is, as all marketing is, to fill a need. And if you figure out what they need, whether it is unique stories, whether it is fascinating photographs, whether it is a specific point of view that they like to endorse, if you give them what they need, they are much more likely to write about you. Now, let's say you do get the interest of a journalist, and they say, this is great, we'd like to interview you. First thing I'm going to suggest is you get some media training. And this is not something you can do in the back room. This is not something you can do on a computer in front of a camera. This is something you need to do in front of real people, and you need to do it with a professional media trainer. I do this training, but lots of journalists just do this as sort of a sideline, just to give people an idea of what it's like to work on this stuff. The problem is, most of us are not used to talking to the media. And the easiest way to understand that process is that I have been interviewed many, many times. Many of those interviews have been 15, 20, 30, an hour long, 15 minutes to an hour long. And usually the media picks 1 or 2 sentences or 1 or 2 minutes from those interviews to use in their story. And I want to emphasize, it's they who pick those minutes. So you talk to me for an hour, and you're going to pick one thing out of the hour. And the problem is, it may not be the thing I would pick, which is why you absolutely have to understand media training, and you absolutely have to understand that every single time you open your mouth, that could be the time they're going to use the quote. And you cannot afford to make mistakes on this. The guy who was quite famous for this, of course, was Ronald Reagan, who no matter, and not a coincidence that Ronald Reagan was, in his previous life, before being a politician, an actor. And when journalists would ask him questions, he would even refuse to accept the premise of the question. He would simply repeat back the lines that he thought were really important. And the advantage to this was there are very few clips of Ronald Reagan saying something he wished he hadn't said. That's not true of most other politicians. So there's a lesson there. Only say things that you want to see in the newspaper the next day. Second thing, as someone in the wine business, focus on content. Don't spend quite so much time worrying about whether you're wearing the right jacket with the right shirt and whether your ties. All of that's television stuff. That's all very well and good. But what you really need to focus on is content. What are the actual words you are saying, and how effective are they? And one of the things we believe very, very strongly is you should write all this stuff out and practice this at home a long time before you sit down in front of a journalist. Be consistent with your style, be consistent with your message. I remember once I was sitting across the desk from a CEO of a major beverage company, and he was being asked about the fact that they had sold one of their brands. And the journalist, who's a good journalist, consistently came back and asked basically the same question as good journalists do, about 4 different ways. The real question was, are you guys selling everything and getting out of the business, or is this just a one-off? And we'd adapted an answer for it, which was, we will continue to evaluate both acquisitions and sales based on the ultimate value they present to our company. And we're not going to say any more than that because there's nothing else we can say. So we asked the question the first time, and he gets that answer. And then he comes around another way and says, so after this brand, what else? What's the next step? Same answer. And then we go around again and again and again, and he comes to it in another direction. And so in the future, are you looking at? Same answer. 4th time the guy asks the question, there's this sort of dead silence. And by the way, we have all of this charted out in front of my CEO. So he has a series of answers that he's going to read off, or at least work from. And as the question comes in, he and I both agree. Number 4. Answer number 4 on that one. So as we're going along and he's asking questions, we're doing this and we're doing that. Finally, the guy one last time says, so he asks the question one more time, and the CEO and I both look at each other and smile. And the journalist himself says, I know. You're evaluating opportunities for both acquisition and sale. And we said, you got it. And you know what appeared in the paper the next day? Exactly that quote. That's the way you manage the media in a way that's effective. What's not effective is when you start saying, well, now that you mention it, I've always thought it would be fun to own something in Venezuela. And all of a sudden, the story goes sideways. Really, what do you like about Venezuela? No. We're here to talk about this specific topic. We're not here to talk about another topic. Don't get trapped into that. Journalists are very, very good. And the best journalists, by the way, often know that the single best question they can ask is silence. So ask a question, wait for the answer. If you think there's more answer than you got, wait. Wait in silence. Most people find silence very difficult. And when you sit there hoping to fill in the silence, you start saying things that aren't on your sheet. And once you start saying things that aren't on your sheet, you start making mistakes and everything goes sideways. So, media training. And again, this cannot happen without practice. Ironically, there is a great place at every winery to practice this. And no winemaker or owner ever spends time there, which is the tasting room. There you have the opportunity to present to the public. You have an opportunity to respond to questions. You can do this on a regular basis. You can really get comfortable and used to the idea. It's a great opportunity, but most wineries really don't do it. And as a result, their spokespeople, whether they are the owner or whether they are the winemaker, usually aren't as polished as they could be. They don't have to be glitzy, but they have to feel like they're comfortable in front of a group. And they're not. And part of the reason is they don't like it. And part of the reason is they don't practice. And practice makes perfect in the tasting room. Okay. Now that we're there, let's talk about some of the things that we really want to talk about in terms of what makes public relations really work. We're going to talk about the press kit. We're going to talk about press releases. We already talked about them a little bit. We're going to get more specific. We're going to address newsletters and why they're not. Then we'll get into trade promotions and events and shows and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's talk about the press kit. Basically, when a journalist calls you up and says, I'd like to do a story about your company, it's really a good idea to give them a press kit. And a press kit is just a reference library on your company. True story. Many years ago, some dear friends of mine who were wonderful restaurateurs and getting a lot of attention and all the rest, they called me and they said, Paul, it's been a few years since somebody wrote a story about us, and if you ever have a journalist visiting you in the Napa Valley, we'll give you a free lunch if you'll bring him to our restaurant. And I thought, well, that's fair. I wouldn't have done it if they hadn't been friends, but they're dear friends. So sure enough, next time a journalist calls me and says, I'm going to be in this town and maybe we can go to lunch, and I say, great idea, I'll pick up lunch for you. And then we go to this restaurant and we have a wonderful lunch. And the journalist is clearly enchanted. And at the end of it all, the owner comes over, they start talking, they shake hands, they have a wonderful conversation, and the owner says, gosh, anything you need, just let us know and we'll get it to you. And the journalist said, well, I'd love a press kit. And there is this long, awkward silence, at which point the owner says, well, we don't have a press kit, but here's a menu. Now, a menu is not a press kit. What the journalist wanted was, I want a biography of the chef and the owner of the restaurant. I want a story, in your words, of how the restaurant got started. I want all that background information so I can write a story. Because right now, all I can write is, went here, had a good time, food tasted good. But how much more interesting a story would it be if I could talk about, the owner and her husband met when they were in chef school in Minneapolis, and then they came to Chicago, blah, 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 blah. That's a much more interesting story. They didn't have a press kit, they didn't get a story. So that's the function of a press kit. What should it have in it? What we call in PR a backgrounder is simply the story you want to tell about your brand or your winery or your business. Okay, it is a combination of the business plan and the marketing plan. Now, it's the story of who you are. Called a backgrounder because in most cases, journalists won't use the whole thing, but they will pull up little items out of it on background to fill in a story. So you need one of those. Next thing is you need a biography of every person who might conceivably be of interest to a journalist. So if you have a winery, the winemaker, that's important. If you're basing all of your wines on specific vineyards, then maybe the vineyard managers. But people, not things. People. You need to tell stories of the people involved, okay? Each person who could talk to the media needs to have a biography. Went to school here, studied this, married, has 2 kids, loves to sail on San Francisco Bay. I don't care what you put into it. Some of it should have something to do with your business, but some of it just needs to be, we're interested in all these other things, and here are other ways the story could go a little bit, as long as they're consistent with your positioning. People. Third thing is your press kit from beginning to end, from the first page to the very last footnote, has to always keep in mind what makes you different. And again, this is the big challenge in the wine business. You haven't defined this. You don't know what it is. How can you do PR? I'm going to tell you, you can't do it very well. So define that, and then literally in the backgrounder, why do they do things this way? Because they've always wanted to make a whole winery based on the concept of Gewürztraminer as a great wine varietal. Okay, fine. Then go in and explain that. Why did they hire this vineyard manager? Because that vineyard manager is quite famous for the role he played in developing Gewürztraminer in Alsace. Why did that? You get my point. Then, let's imagine you're a journalist. You've met the winery, or you've gone to the restaurant, or you've stayed at the hotel. You've met the key people. They're interesting people. It's a good story. What would make this story really pop? Well, wouldn't it be great if we had a photo of the winemaker in the winery? Wouldn't it be great if we had a photo of the chef in the restaurant? Wouldn't it be great if we had a photo of the spa? Anything that you think supports your marketing position and the media might need for a story, take a photograph of it. Take a, by the way, professional photograph of it, and add that to your press kit so that as they write, they say, oh, this is perfect. I can even write a little about this because here's a photo that illustrates that. True story. Years and years ago, we were representing one of the less famous wineries in Monterey County. And one of the major wine magazines called up and said, Paul, we have a problem. We're doing a story on Monterey. We don't have the photographer we were going to hire can't make it. So we're just looking for anybody who has a good generic photograph of Monterey wine. And it just turned out that we had the year before done a photo shoot with a famous chef and our winemaker standing on the beach making paella on the beach in Monterey with sailboats in the background and all the rest. It was a really good sort of Monterey lifestyle shot. And so we sent that and a few others to the publication, and when you opened up the story on Monterey, across the whole double-page spread was this photograph with a caption about how our winemaker, who again, not one of the big boys, but our winemaker enjoying a paella dinner on the beach with famous chef Tal Tal Tal. And all of that simply because we had the photograph and nobody else had the photograph. So you need photographs. And now we're going to talk a little, same thing, recipes. If you're a restaurant and people want to write about something, you need to give them a recipe, etc. Let's talk about format, because even though press releases these days, and by the way, press kits, last time I handed a press kit to somebody, a printed press kit on paper, was 15, 20 years ago. I handed it to a journalist who took one look at it and said, how many trees died to create this? So, true story, press kits should be all electronic. All the files should be easily managed. Don't send PDFs that can't be copied and pasted, because you know what? What journalists want to do is copy and paste. As we'll see here as we get into format and style, all the rest. If you write exactly in AP, Associated Press style, it makes it easy for journalists to simply say, well, here's a paragraph I can use, snip, snip, drop it right into their story, saves them money, saves them time. Journalists like that. What do they need? They need more money, they need more time. So any way you can make this easy for journalists basically to steal. Remember, you want them to steal it. That's why you're creating this. Make it easy for them to steal. My writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in U.S. News and World Report, Time Magazine, New York Times. Never said Paul Wagner as a byline, but I can show you the paragraph in the press kit, and I can show you the paragraph in the story, and they're identical. Because I copied their style effectively enough that they just dropped it into place. That's what a good agency does. Beware of PR agencies that are really wild and zany and creative and still want to go after these traditional media sources, because media sources won't use that stuff. So, absolutely consistent in style, absolutely consistent, make it easy to steal. And of course, these days, they don't even want to get it on a USB drive or a disc or something, a CD. They want it on your website. They want it easy to access. And I always think it's funny, there are companies that put their press information in a separate site on their website, and they say press only. And then you have to go in and register and say, okay, I am a journalist, and because I'm a journalist, I deserve access to this site. Because what is it you want the journalist to do with that information? Well, in fact, what you want that journalist to do is to take that information and tell the general public about it. Well, if you want them to tell the general public about it, why don't you just tell the general public about it yourself? Put it on your website where anybody can see it. Okay, so Website now has become the press kit. Admittedly, all this stuff doesn't go on the front page because for most people going to your website, there may be other things that are more important, but somewhere in all of this, it should be when you click on About Us or Our Story, that's where this press kit starts to fill out. And it can be a huge tree, almost like a river delta, that you enter it by saying, okay, here, I want to know a little more about the company, and then it offers you all these different threads to explore depending on your interest. That's a good press kit. That's a good reference library for people who want to write about you, and it's all written in a style that they can copy, paste, drop into their own story, and it works perfectly. And of course, anytime you send anything to the media, you need to include contact information, because the first thing any journalist wants to know when they get a piece of information is, who can I call to confirm this? How can I check this out? Can I call somebody for an interview? I have questions. And if you don't give them an easy way to reach you to get questions answered, you won't be successful. Questions? Press releases. Yeah, again, wineries, wine companies, they usually don't have press releases. These are not announcements. Announcements, something you might tell the employees is an announcement, but news is news. It means it matters. The great rule I got early on in my career, I called a local journalist and I said, listen, I'd really like to pitch you on a great story. And he says, great. He says, listen, I'm really kind of busy. Can this wait until tomorrow? And I said, absolutely. And he said, good, it's not news. Perfect illustration of what news is. If it can't wait until tomorrow, it's news. Now, for example, I once called up years ago the beverage reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle because I had a client who had just told me they were filming out at what was then Candlestick Park, to give you an idea how long ago this was. But they were filming commercials for a new sports drink that was going to compete with Gatorade. And the people involved were Dick Butkus, Joe Montana, Roger Craig, the biggest names in football at the time. And I knew this was news. I knew this would come out fairly soon, and I knew it was happening in San Francisco, so I called the San Francisco Chronicle, and I asked to talk to the beverage editor. And I got somebody in the newsroom who said, I'm sorry, he's not here right now. Can I take a message? And I said, well, I just want to pitch him on a story. And the guy says, well, I'm really busy, but what's the story? And I said, well, Joe Montana, Roger Craig, and Dick Butkus are launching a new sports drink to compete with Gatorade. And he said, send me the information. And I said, okay. And he said, do you have photos? And I said, I don't know if we have photos, but we certainly have posters and illustrations that are going to be used to market the drink. He said, send them to me. I said, great, what's your name? He gave me his name, and I realized he was the head business editor for the entire paper. He knew a story when he saw one. And so a really good example of how news involves important people and something that if it can wait till tomorrow, his concern was, if somebody else in San Francisco, or even worse, can you imagine if the Oakland Tribune had printed that story before the Chronicle found out about it, his role as a news editor would be threatened. He needed that story. Perfect example. We've talked about AP style and format. This is taught in every basic PR course. You should take one if you have time, but some very basic rules for all of this of how you start a story, where the byline goes, where the dateline goes, where the title goes, what goes at the bottom to let people know there's no more after this part. And again, absolute conventions. New York Times always refers to every individual by Mr. or Ms. and their last name. So even though you may have a very informal winery and want to talk, everybody wants to talk about your winemaker Larry, trust me, if you're putting it in AP style, it will be Mr. Brown or Mr. White. It will not be Larry. So don't call him Larry in your press release. Now, if you want to have him called Larry, then interview someone else, like a vineyard manager who says about him, well, and then this goes in quotes, and then it becomes clear, well, I love working with Larry because blah, 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 and then that can appear. But when the story in its own voice refers to any individual, Mr. or Ms. always. And so you can just go through and as you learn AP style, all of this stuff is very clear. There are books you can buy that'll, and God forbid, there are websites that'll teach you how to do AP style. Second thing is research the facts. We have an old saying in my business, never research a good story. You might find out it's not true. But it is true, and I can tell you any number of times that I have sat down with a client and they're telling me this wonderful story. We were the first people to do that, and when my wife did this and all that, and then I start checking into that and I say, you said you were the first people to do this, but it turns out this, well, yeah, he did it, but he didn't do it the way we did it. Well, wait a minute. If you're going to say first is something that matters in news, you need to be very sure. We're the biggest, how do you know that? Well, because we think we are. Not good enough. Because journalists, when it appears in print, will then get the other guy calling up and saying, what the hell do you mean he was first? We did this 4 years before he did. He copied everything. So now you've done two things. You've ensured that the journalist will write a correction to say they weren't the first, they were the second because this other guy did it. But the other thing is you've poisoned your relationship with that journalist because now you've made him look like a jackass. Bad idea. So, for example, what was the first commercial winery in California? There are lots of applicants to this. Charles Krug, the first commercial winery in Napa Valley, still in existence. There may have been one before, but it didn't survive. Buena Vista, the first in the North Coast. But then there was a winery in Los Angeles. So depending on how you claim it, you can argue, but you need to be able to justify your claim with real facts. So make sure you research the facts and never, never, never lie to the media. Read the publications. Find out what they want and what kind of press releases they run before you send them a press release that doesn't look like anything they've ever done before and is actually aimed really at the trade, and they're a consumer publication. And why are you wasting their time? The U.S. Department of Agriculture for years and years and years paid an entire staff of PR people to write press releases, and they sent them in a huge manila envelope to every newsroom in America. And they arrived in the newsroom, and the newsroom very calmly took those and tossed them in the trash because there was so much that they couldn't use. It wasn't worth reading through all that stuff to get the few things they could use. So keep that in mind every time you send something out to the media. Is this absolutely going to be something look at and say, huh, even if I can't use it, this is cool. I need to keep in touch with these guys. Another thing, if you're dealing with journalists and you're not getting anywhere, or you're pitching a story to a journalist or to journalists and they're not biting, not a bad idea to just call up an editor and say, hey, listen, I wonder if you got 5 minutes. I'm talking to some people about this, and I'm wondering, is this a story you'd be interested in? And the editor may say, nah, the next 3 months is all going to be about coronavirus, for example, or the next 3 months is pretty much dedicated to holiday coverage, so I don't think we can use that. Okay, good. Now you have valuable information. Go back to that story, refine it, turn it so that it somehow applies to what that editor wanted, and resell or resend the story to that editor or to that journalist. Remember, editors assign stories to journalists, and sometimes journalists try to sell stories to editors. So you can work both sides of that equation if you understand their roles and work with them in a supportive way. If a journalist tells you, I hate that product and never want to write about it, and you call his editor and say, hey, we'd really like you to ask this guy to write about it, even if the editor assigns the story, the journalist is going to go through the roof. So don't play it that way. Okay? To me, this is art. This is wonderful fun to sit down and figure out, we have this piece and we have that piece, we have a connection with that journalist. How can we make this fit into a program that works for everybody? Again, a story from my own background. I called up a journalist and I said, I have a great deal for you. I'm working on with the cork industry in Portugal, and we'd like to take you to spend a full week, all expenses paid, in Portugal to visit cork companies. And he said, that's a really great idea, but I can't possibly afford to do that. And I said, no, you didn't understand. It's all expenses paid. And he said, no, Paul, you don't understand. All expenses paid mean I don't have expenses. My house is still here. My wife is still here. My kids are still here. So I have expenses. I just don't have any expenses in Portugal. And what you're offering me is one story that I can possibly sell to one publication. And that means maybe $500. And if I made $500 a week, I couldn't afford to stay alive. So not a chance. I said, what if we got you more stories? He said, Well, okay. I said, because one of the places we're going to visit is a port winery where they've promised to do a vertical tasting of ports going back from today back into the 30s. So there would be a second story. He said, yeah, still, $1,000 a week, do the math, Paul. That doesn't work for me. So I said, let me get back to you on this. I wasn't prepared for that answer, but I was prepared to call the client back and say, what else can we do for this guy? So I called him back and I said, I got two other stories for you. You're going to be staying at a series of historic national posadas. These are national historic inns. And you're going to be staying in 4 of them over the course of the week. So there's another story right there about how these historic inns are a great way to visit Portugal. And then the third one is we're calling on 2 of the most famous restaurants in Portugal. And the chef has agreed to come out and be interviewed by you so you can do a story about the emerging food scene in Portugal as well. That's 4 stories. He said, 4 stories, that's $2,000 in a week. That's worth my time. Sign me up. So if you can figure out, if you can listen, not just talk, but figure out what they need, what they want, and work that into a package, you have a much better chance of success. Let's talk about sending wine to journalists. What do you expect to get out of this? Well, we'd like them to taste our wine. Just so you know, there's absolutely no guarantee that if you send wine to a journalist, they're going to taste it. Top journalists who are allowed to accept free samples, and by the way, some are not, often get 100 to 300 samples per week. The Wine Spectator, this has become such an issue that there's actually a process, and you have to request permission from them to make sure that the samples you're sending might conceivably be of interest to them before they'll even taste the wine. If your wine is not in distribution, it's a brand new release, never before released, not in distribution, they don't want to taste it because, frankly, they don't want their readers calling up and saying, what are you guys doing tasting wines that nobody can get? So you need to start at the beginning, just like a press kit or anything else. What are you trying to achieve? Who is the audience here? Again, don't send European wine to that guy who only writes about California wine. Don't send $6 white Zinfandel to guys who only write about collector Cabernet. You need to understand who these people are, and you need to be specific about them. These days, in most cases, I believe the appropriate technique is actually call the journalist first and say, we'd like to send you something. Here's what we'd like to send you. Do you think that's appropriate? Can you use this? Here's why it should be of interest to you. We also believe pretty strongly in putting our samples in special packages, which is to say journalists probably, again, some journalists get 100, 300 bottles of wine, let's say 30, 40, 50 packages of wine a week. A lot of this stuff doesn't even get opened. It gets donated to a local charity. It gets given to neighbors. It collects in rooms where they're going to use it for some other kind of tasting, and then it doesn't, and then they drink it or they give it to friends. Or, I mean, it doesn't end up where you want it to be. So we often, if we've talked to them and we know they're expecting this package, we'll do something on the outside of the box that will indicate of all of those brown cardboard boxes in your lobby or in your hallway today, this is the one we talked about that had those wines you really wanted, just so they'll open that box, even if they don't open the rest. Editorial calendars, we've talked about this before, but just as in advertising, the editorial calendars for advertising coincide with the editorial calendars for the journalism stories, so that as you understand an editorial calendar for a publication, you can say, ooh, they're going to be, in June, they're going to be writing about the perfect wines to serve at barbecues. I need to figure out in February who needs to get samples of our Barbera because we think that's a great barbecue wine. And you start working that system. Rather than simply saying, we're releasing our Barbera and we're sending it to every journalist in the country, now I believe you're much smarter off doing a very targeted rifle rather than shotgun. This guy that week, et cetera, et cetera. And the same applies, by the way, to wine competitions. You need to decide who gets the wines for competitions, which competitions to enter, which wines to enter. We are the leading producer of Gewürztraminer. Don't enter your Riesling, because if your Riesling gets a gold medal and all the Gewürzes get silvers, how can you be the leading producer of Gewürztraminer? It sounds like you don't know what you're doing. All of those factors come into play as you're thinking about this stuff. which is why good agencies will have somebody who literally spends a lot of their time simply researching what are the editorial calendars, when are the competitions, when are the other opportunities that arise for our wines, and then literally they write themselves and everybody else a reminder, remember that by Thursday we need to send this wine to that person to get it out in time. So all of that ties into press mailings and how you send them out to people. Okay. So now we go on to special events, and we're going to talk about a few different things here. Wine festivals, and perhaps the biggest wine festival in North America is the Vancouver International Wine Festival. 25,000 people attend that one. I've been a speaker there for the last 3 years, and it's really quite an amazing experience. Of course, you have the New York, the Wine Spectator's New York Wine Experience, which is a big deal at the end of October every year. There are other wine festivals around. The question is, do you participate? In the Wine Spectator, the question is, do you get invited to participate? Because as a producer, that's by invitation only. And then we talk about donations a little bit moving forward here. We'll talk about market visits. Market visits we did a pretty good job of during the advertising lecture, and then talk about generating word of mouth. We talked about this also in the advertising and promotion lecture, how important it is for you to be there, whether they will notice if you're there or not. And again, I want to tell a related story here. We once worked for a large engineering company, and the engineering company needed, as they explained, that we need a new trade show booth because we're going to participate in this it's the big conference for our specialty every year. And we just found out that our competitor is building a massive new trade show booth. And we need to build one to be competitive with it. And I'm thinking, boy, this is going to be a lot of money. This is a great job for our agency. This is wonderful. So we start talking about what makes them different. And first of all, they're one of the two big companies in the business. Good. The more we talk about them, and the more we understand how we do business, there's one thing that really stands out to me, which is they're really charming, interesting, fun engineers to talk to. And you know what? That's rare. Most engineers, no offense intended to be given here, most engineers are not your most entertaining people. These guys were great. And the more I thought about this, and the more I talked about, well, how can we communicate this at the trade show, and how can we... And I finally came back to them about halfway through the process of designing the booth, and I said, you know, guys, I have another idea that would be a lot better. What you ought to do is rent a hospitality suite at the hotel. It'll cost you a little more than the rental space for the trade show booth. But don't take a booth. What you need to do is all wear matching jackets, because really, in the world you're in, there are only about 3 or 4 clients that you really care about. The rest of them are pretty small potatoes. You really just want these 3 or 4 big guys that are walking around the trade show, right? Yeah, that's right. So wear your little special jackets that identify you as all coming from the same company. And instead of standing at your booth and waiting for these guys to arrive and then try to spend an hour with them, go out and walk the trade show floor. And every time you see one of these guys, one of you should walk over and just start talking to them. And invite them up for lunch at your hospitality suite. And take advantage of the fact that you're more fun to talk to than any of the other companies. Well, there was a lot of back and forth about that, but in the end they decided to do it, and they landed 3 of the 4 contracts. Maybe because of that, maybe because they're very smart people, but it does show that I can talk myself out of a lot of money in a hurry. And thinking this through strategically is really important. Understand what you're trying to accomplish when you go to that trade show. If you don't know, why are you going? If you don't know what you're trying to do, you're just wandering around lost in the wilderness. So don't do that. And again, we've talked about this in the market, in the advertising section, about have goals. How many business cards do you want to collect? How many distributors do you want to talk to? How many retailers? How many restaurateurs? Have a checklist. Work it all out in advance so that you can look at all of this stuff and say, okay, it's going to cost us this much money. It's going to take 2 staff members. We're going to have to pour this much wine. But in the end, if we can sign up 12 people for our wine club and give out 75 coupons for consumers to visit the winery, and let's assume they each buy wine, and maybe 2 of them become wine club members, and we want to talk to one major journalist who's going to be there, and you start working this out, well, then it makes sense to do it. And when you go to that event, you should then have that checklist to say, okay, we said we wanted to meet a new distributor in Iowa. We've met 2 of them. That's good. We said we wanted to talk to 5 restaurateurs in St. Louis. We've talked to 5. We said we wanted to talk to 6 retailers. We've only got 2. Let's go find some retailers. So it actually gives you direction during the event of where you need to focus your attention in the future. And then, of course, at the end, it allows you to evaluate whether or not you achieved those goals and whether or not it was worth your time and energy. Only way to do it. And the same is true of events and promotions. You have to start with what do we hope to achieve and what are our budgets. And we've started, for example, with clients that say, we want to do a campaign for new, we did one campaign once for a company that made ice wine. And we wanted to encourage people to enter a competition for cocktails with ice wine. So we promoted this in bartending magazines, in on-premise magazines. We got the recipes. We had a panel of people who judged the recipes and tasted them and figured out which ones were best. That was a bit of an adventure. But the goal was twofold. One of them was we wanted to eventually come out with 3 new recipes. Again, kind of a roundup story. Here are the 3 hottest new recipes for ice wine. Well, maybe people don't know their recipes. That's a category, but we've just created category. Recipe for ice wine. So it gets everybody reading the stories to think, maybe I should keep in the back of my mind the fact that there are recipes and I need one for ice wine. But the other thing it did was we wanted to give a lot of bartenders around the country the opportunity to participate, to get to know the brand, to open the wine, to taste the wine, to play with it. And so we ended up getting 150 entries, I think, of some of these things, 150 different bartenders. And then, of course, we were able to work with the sales team to go in there and say, hey, saw you entered the contest, really appreciate that. I know you didn't win, but here's something we're going to do for you, and it builds relationships. All of that laid out, by the way, not afterwards. That was all laid out in advance as part of the strategic plan for this program. So lay all that stuff out in advance, and remember that if you don't execute all the steps, it doesn't happen. So you want to match partners with your key messages. If you are a producer of extremely fine wines, you probably don't want to partner with Skoda Motor Company if they still exist. You need to find people who work within if you're fun and informal and relaxed, you probably don't want to deal with Cartier as your partner as a jeweler. You need to look for partners who work with you. If you're natural and local and organic, then obviously the people you should work with are natural and local and organic. And I remember all too well a wonderful conversation I had with Chef Cindy Paulson, who Mustard's Grill and Fog City Diner and a number of really good restaurants. And I called her up and I said, Cindy, I understand you use one of my customers' products. And she says, oh yeah, we love them. And I said, well, we're looking for a couple of recipes that use those products, and we could send those out across the country to other chefs looking for a way to use the products. And she said, oh, I'm happy to do that. And I said, great, how much do we owe you? And she said, why would you pay me? You're promoting me. I'm happy to do this because I believe in your product. I like your product. I don't use products I don't believe in, and you're promoting me across the country. To me, this is a win-win, and that's a perfect partner. Again, when we talk about how you, and we're going to get more into this when we talk about donations, it's possible to negotiate. So with Cindy, we didn't have to negotiate at all. She was a sweetheart, and I still have a warm spot in my heart for Cindy Paulson. But with other companies, you may have to sit down and say, gee, this is all really good, but we would really like to see you do this as well. You can ask for more. Please feel free to outline that program and say, the perfect partner will do all of these things. And sure, you want to ask us to do an extra thing? We can do that extra thing. But if we do it, then we'll have to, what are you going to do for us in return? Let's see if we can't make this work. Years ago, we did a project with Franciacorta, the beautiful sparkling wine from Italy, in New York during the pre-holiday season, where we held receptions for at top Italian design companies, and we defined those as fashion, furniture, and cars. So we had a Maserati dealership participate, we had a Ferrari dealership participate, we had Dolce & Gabbana, we had Prada, and in each case, we told them we're going to donate all the fixings for a reception for 200 people. You get to invite 100 of your top customers to this, free of charge. We get to invite 100 of our top trade customers to this. And our goal was to get distributors and retailers in New York and restaurateurs to be walking around Ferraris, looking at fabulously stylish people who own and love Ferraris, drinking Franciacorta and thinking, man, this is the way, this is great stuff. I want to be more a part of this. And it was a pretty darn successful promotion. Talk a little bit about newsletters, because in my definition, newsletters are not new and they're not letters. So what are they? Blogs have this same problem. A newsletter, of course, traditionally was mailed out. Now they're emailed out, although many wine clubs still put a printed newsletter in their wine shipments. And those newsletters are always boring. They're always a recipe from Mama. And they're always a story from the winemaker about what the harvest is like, and the harvest is always wonderful. And dear God, nobody reads this stuff. In fact, I've always asked my wine club clients, why don't you just take half of the wine club shipment and send half with the newsletter and half without the newsletter, and see if anybody calls to complain. Nobody will. Why? They're not news. They're tired, they're trite, they're what everybody says about everything. You don't have a goal or a budget. You just think we have to do a newsletter for the wine club. I would encourage you to think about them very differently. I would encourage you to think about them as direct mail sales. In other words, you want a call to action. In each newsletter, you want to get people to say, I want to do something. And it doesn't necessarily need to be buy wine. It may be we want you to call a number, or we need you to choose between two different label designs we're considering. What we're looking for is engagement. What we're looking for is people to feel part of your community, and sending them an impersonal newsletter that says, Dear Wine Club member, here's the news from our winery, and guess what? It's springtime and the buds are breaking on the vines. No kidding. Doesn't do any of that. So build brand loyalty, build engagement, interact with these people rather than just talking at them, and you might be more successful. Every time you write something to a consumer, the question has to be, how can I make this more personal, more human, and less expected? How can, in every communication I have, can remember the Pixar line about how to tell a story, you need to surprise them and charm them. How can you surprise them with everything you do? And then ultimately, particular if you're a winery, the goal is get them into the winery to buy more wine. What are you doing in that newsletter that makes them not just say, next time we're in Napa, we should probably stop by, but oh my gosh, we need to make a trip to pick this up because this is totally cool. It may be, remember Jean-Charles Boisset with his bizarre and wonderful promotions of all kinds. Now he's got the tasting table where you move glasses around and you push parts of the table and different things light up, and it's an adventure. But those are the sorts of things that bring people to the winery. I don't know if Dario Satui sends out stories about a new sausage he's got in the deli, but why not? Because those are the sorts of things that get people involved, okay? Our cat has kittens, probably a better idea than we've got a new Sauvignon Blanc release. And now we get to one of my favorite topics in terms of public relations, which is every single time you open your mouth, when you are representing your company, your brand, whether it be to the media, to your neighbor, to a public official, to a consumer, you are ultimately creating and defining and either meeting or failing to meet expectations. And to me, this is a very difficult lesson for a lot of people to learn. But there's this classic old rule that says satisfied customers tell 8 people about a wonderful customer service experience. Unhappy customers tell 22 people. And now that and this was, by the way, pre-social media, so I would guess these days you're going to see these numbers skyrocket, particularly on the back end. because people just love to go online and tell horrible stories about what happened to them. Your business has to be perfect to get the recommendations, and that means every single expectation has to be met. Not just by you, but by every employee. That means training, that means a clear understanding of messaging and goals, and of course it also means in terms of public relations, we talked about this a little bit with Yelp and TripAdvisor, social media, you have to respond when you see something online. You have to deal with it. If you don't meet those expectations, you lose. One of my favorite stories is a story about Pride Mountain up there, just above us on Mount, not Mount St. Helena, but Spring Mountain. There we are, on Spring Mountain. And small winery, way up in the woods. Nobody gets to Pride Mountain without looking for it. So they've got a pretty dedicated customer base. And one of the things they do is when they ship out their wine club shipments, they actually call their wine club members and say, we're about to ship out wine. You going to be home? Because if you're not going to be home and it for some reason ends up sitting in a warehouse or a truck or, God forbid, on your porch for 10 days, whether it's hot or cold or sunny or rainy or snowy or whatever, that's not a good thing. So they call. Good customer service. Effective way to do things, by the way. Lets them know how many of their customers are still alive, which is also a good thing. So one of the guys gets the call, and he calls back and he says, you know, I am going to be home when you ship that out, but I'm going to be out in Napa in September. I'm driving out with my brother, and we're doing a road trip, and we're going to spend 2 weeks visiting wineries in all around, and we're driving a van full of wine back to the home. So I could can I save shipping expenses and just pick up the wine? So some wineries would say, no, I'm sorry, we have to send it to you. Other wineries would say, sure, and then figure, oh crap, no, we've got to figure out a way to store this wine for this guy and find it. And others would say, yeah, okay, fine, and we'll put it here in the customer hold bin, and we've got it for you. But the person from Pride Mountain said, gee, that's great. When in September are you going to be here? And he said, well, it looks like Napa is going to be the 9th through the 13th of September. And she said, that's perfect, because on the 12th, we're having a big barbecue for a couple of our distributors from back east. And if you show up, you're invited. It'll be fun. It'll be a little barbecue. You can hang out, just sort of, have some fun with this and join the party. 4 days later, he went on every wine chat board in the country to say, just got back from my trip to Pride Mountain. Tells about the party. Told about how wonderful the winery is. He came in second in the bocce ball tournament. And it cost them, in total, maybe 3 glasses of wine and a couple of barbecued ribs. And yet they created a missionary for life. And to me, that is a story that is really indicative of where customer service can take you. From a customer who thinks you're nice to a customer who will literally go on every message board he knows and say, these guys are the greatest winery in the world. And that's what you want with every interaction, with every customer, and with every public with whom you are having relations. Finally, and we talk about this again, I'll mention this again in social media, FaceTime is better than Facebook. And this is before Facebook came out with FaceTime. This is real time in front of people's faces. You need to give your customers the tools they need to be active on social media. Give them the photos they want. Give them the stories. When they get to the winery, give them the hashtags. Provide free Wi-Fi. Your staff should be professional. I'm always amused at this when I go into some restaurant and somebody says, will you take a picture? And they go get Rob, because Rob is the really good photographer. Every restaurant should have one waiter who's really good at taking photos, because that ultimately gets you better social media. If you don't know how to do this, send your waiters to a photography class for a couple of weeks and let them learn how to take good photos. It'll only take a few hours to train them, but then they do much better job and you get much better social media. I love the idea of creating large visuals. so that when they take the photo, there's something in the background that gives your name and it indicates where they are. Humor is good. All of this stuff to get people involved, but all of this stuff has to happen not on Facebook. It has to happen when they're with you. So that is critical. And I love contests with winners because anyone who ever wins a contest immediately puts it on his Facebook page and tells everybody else. So just like soccer teams for under 7-year-olds, make sure everybody wins something. Few other ideas that we've done over the years. We've done a Twitter Taste Live where we literally put our winemaker in a store with a group of consumers, but then we have journalists and even sometimes other stores around the country who are all participating in the tasting of this wine at the same time, and all on Twitter posting about it, and it actually can make you trend on Twitter. It was pretty successful. Second thing is show your bottle everywhere. I'm just amazed at the number of wineries that don't give people the opportunity to really show off, no matter where you are. Here's a bottle of our wine. Here's a bottle of our wine. We've had customers or clients who organized, send us a photo of your favorite place to drink our wine, and got all sorts of wonderful entries from people on top of Mount Whitney. God forbid they carried the wine up there, to people on the beach, to people in their favorite restaurant, to people in their home, all enjoying their wine. What a great social media feed for people to share. And then, of course, viral marketing. All these elements come into play as you give people reasons to continue to participate. And at all consumer and trade events, you should have all this stuff. You should have, if you can, free Wi-Fi, at least at your booth, even if it means spending some money to do it. You should have some visual that really gets people's attention and lets them, oh yeah, I want to have my picture taken with that guy or that gal or in that costume or with that backdrop. You need to think about all of this stuff because ultimately it's how social media works. And again, that's a key element of public relations. And public relations ultimately will make your marketing far more effective. And we will talk about this. I guess my social media lecture is next, but the reviews matter. You can encourage positive reviews. Lots of companies, tasting rooms, when you go to their website, when you go to the tasting room and you use their Wi-Fi, will send you a little note back saying, gee, hope you enjoyed your visit, loved having you here. By the way, if you had a good time, go on TripAdvisor and rate your visit for us. We love to hear from our customers, but all that's a way of generating traffic. You do have to respond to negative reviews. We'll talk about that a little more with Serena Williams, as you'll see in that show. But just accept it. This is now part of your job as a public relations person. So, seems easy. That's a long lecture. It seems easy, pretty simple, but you can see in the application, the devil is in the details. You absolutely have to execute against all of this stuff. You need to know your message. You need to identify your audience. And then the delivery of that message really gets down to the nitty-gritty. You need to plan it. You need to execute it. You need to eventually evaluate the results to see that you're doing a good job with public relations. But if you're a small company, you can't possibly afford to buy full-page ads in the Wine Spectator. You certainly can't afford to buy commercials during the Super Bowl. You need some way of building your brand in a small community, in a regional community, maybe in a state or a series of states. The single best way you can do that in terms of marketing communications is through public relations, and I hope today's lecture will give you an idea of how to do that. Thanks.